The Persuaders at the front lines of the fight for hearts, minds, and democracy is the title of Anand Giridharadas' latest book. He is a former foreign correspondent and columnist, and he is with me from Brooklyn, New York. Hi there, Anand. You know, persuasion in politics is what campaigning, I think, used to be about, convincing voters that your ideas about social services, taxes, whatever, to make your community better. But in 2022, I've talked to so many people here who say they don't even talk politics with their family or friends because it inflames such anger. What's your assessment of the state of the United States right now?
Well, the United States is in a really big pickle because democracy itself is being tested in this country, as it has only been in truly intense moments in American history. Right now, one of the two major political parties is essentially running to sabotage the practice of democracy itself, and that's the modern Republican Party that is running on a platform of white racial resentment, male grievance at having to live in an egalitarian world, and trying to, overturn the will of the people in many contests across the country, and advocate for political violence as a normal way to kind of get the world you want. So in that context, it is as important, if not more important than ever, for those on the pro-freedom, pro-democracy side, the Democratic Party and its allies in the United States, to be able to persuade. And you're right, it has gotten harder. And more importantly, people have lost faith in the idea of persuasion and the possibility of persuasion. And the problem is the notion that people's minds can't be changed simply isn't true. Just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible. People's minds have changed drastically on gay rights in our lifetime. People's minds have actually changed quite a bit on race in our lifetime. People's minds have changed on the role and relationships of men and women in our lifetime, and many other things. And so I spent the last few years reporting this book on the Persuaders, about people who refuse to give up on the core activity of democratic life, attempting to change minds in order to change things. And I tried to figure out what their playbook is for doing so in an age of us and them when it seems so hard.
And so what is the playbook, if you can condense it? I mean, you are offering some hope, how to work to bridge divisions, to find common ground. How do you do it?
Well, I think the anti-democracy movement, the fascist movement increasingly in the United States, is actually quite good at understanding human beings as we actually are and building a politics on top of a realistic sense of how people form their opinions, what their emotional response to the news is, what their fears and anxieties are. And in many ways, what the Persuaders book is arguing for is for pro-freedom, pro-democracy forces in this country to become better at a human-centered politics. And so the playbook starts from that. Deal with people as they really are. So a few things. I think commanding attention is incredibly important in the moment in time we are in, right? The days where the media, had tens of millions of eyeballs is gone. We live in a fragmented time where the ability to cut through noise and command attention is important. The far right is very good at this. Often more progressive forces are not, more high-minded. I think there's a need to build transcendent movements, to actually have a strategy for belonging. Again, the right has, in many countries, built fervor through movements, through connection, through belonging, through things like the Trump rally. And I think often the political left has not built adequate, benign counterofferings to those things, really inviting people into a cause, not leaving them cold with just policy talk. I think there's a notion of being willing to pick fights. It's another part of the Persuaders playbook, being willing to pick righteous fights. With all due respect to Michelle Obama, who some years ago said, when they go low, we go high. I think it's also possible to say, when they go low, we hit harder. And finally, I think you have to tell the better story about your country. In this case, the United States. It can't be left to those who want to destroy democracy to actually offer a narrative about the country, actually claim patriotism. I believe pro-freedom, pro-democracy forces ought to be telling a patriotic, galvanizing, thrilling story about America, a true story about the effort to build an incredible multiracial democracy. And that story needs to, frankly, outcompete the story of those who would break the country rather than share it.
So let me ask you why you think that has not happened on the Democratic side. The Republicans, as you say, have been good at commanding attention, maybe better at sort of meeting people where they're at. Why have the Democrats up till now dropped the ball on that?
I think it's a very good question. I think it's a high-mindedness, and I think it comes from a good place at some deep level. I think there's a sense that there's a belief in citizens that is kind of almost like a classical, like ancient Greek idea of citizens as, people who are sitting at home and pondering the issues and forming their stances on immigration and taxes in the light of reason. This kind of tradition that comes to us from Plato and Aristotle and a lot of, old philosophy behind democracy. I think the reality is we ain't actually like that. Political opinion formation is a much more emotional process than that kind of picture gives it credit for being. People's, whether in Canada or the United States, people's views of immigration or how to deal with social services is really often based on their kind of fear and anxiety about the world, about whether they feel threatened or whether they feel abundant, whether they feel there's enough or not. And so I think Democrats have in the U.S. gotten into a pattern of imagining who they wished voters were and speaking to that high-minded person in a kind of policy language, a wonky language, and not really being a guttural party, not able to speak to the gut, not able to speak to the reptile brain, and looking down on things like storytelling, looking down on things like message as being unnecessary or a simple piece of evidence for this is I ask Americans all the time, what's the last great line from a major American leader, from a speech that you can quote to me from the last few years? And, virtually nobody can quote anything from major American leaders on the pro-democracy, pro-freedom side. That just feels like an own goal. I mean, in what world does one not need the rhetoric of a lifetime, among many other things, to outcompete fascism? You have in many races in the midterms tonight, and Kathy Hochul, the governor candidate for the Democrats in New York, who are boring, lifeless figures who no one has any passion for. Even their own surrogates will admit they're just not a passion candidate. They're not a movement candidate. There's no attempt to present them as such. Well, how are you going to outcompete election deniers and other kind of scammers who are speaking to people with this very fear-based, anxiety-based, emotional-based appeal with people who just leave voters cold? We need a real renaissance on the political left if we are going to outcompete fascism and seize the age and deliver people the future of nice things that we deserve.
Misinformation and disinformation has created a world where voters can't even agree on basic facts, on what's true, what's lie. So how does the American political system pull itself out of that death spiral?
Yeah, the disinformation crisis is one of the hardest crises in this conversation about persuasion. And among the many persuaders I talked to for the book were two specialists on disinformation and kind of cult manipulation, right? 43 million Americans now believe in the QAnon disinformation kind of conspiracy, right? That is 1 out of 7 adults who essentially belong to a mass decentralized cult. It doesn't meet up in real life, but it functions in many ways like a cult. And many family members in America will tell you they've lost relatives, parents, children, nieces, nephews, coworkers to this cult. And then you have, just disinformation promoted on social media, promoted by outlets like Fox News and others. And I spoke to these two experts who said, look, we're going to have to, at some level, accept disinformation as endemic in the age of the internet, right? We can try to shut it down or pressure advertisers or hope that Elon Musk's mama, talks some sense into her wayward little boy. But in reality, there's going to be this disinformation in the ether. And therefore, we need a public health approach to something that is endemic, which is to say, to develop in people the resistance to being conned by disinformation instead of our, I think, present focus in trying to shut off the spigots of it. And what that means is really an educational revolution. And there were many subjects that were not once taught in schools that now are. They're now considered core to human development. Sex education was once something that happened at home, if at all, or people figured it out on their own. At some point, it was felt, no, every child needs a certain standard sex education to be a fully flourishing human being who's not going to be taken advantage of and can live a good life. Well, being able to be resistant to disinformation, being able to detect classic tactics of manipulation, classic deception tactics. This may be, we may conclude, core to what an education looks like in the 21st century. And we're going to need to develop curriculum in schools, YouTube videos, any number of interventions to train young people and people of all ages, frankly, to detect when they are being conned before it is too late.
You know, up in Canada, we watch with great concern and interest about what's happening in the United States. You've already said you think democracy is in peril. Can you give us an optimistic message about the future?
Well, I'll say two things about that. First of all, you know, one of the things that's been disappointing, just since you brought up Canada watching, you know, one of the things that's been disappointing in the last few years in America is actually how few supposed American allies around the world speak in clear and blunt terms about what is happening in the United States. And I understand America is very powerful, and one doesn't want to speak ill of the United States. But, you know, I would hope that if this kind of democratic decay were happening in other places, you know, Americans and American leaders would speak out. And it would be actually great to have more world leaders speaking out about the erosion of democracy in America, the way world leaders so confidently speak out about, you know, that happening in so-called third world countries. Here's the hope. I think it's incredibly important to remember why there is a fascist uprising in the United States right now, not just to start with the fact that there is. This fascist uprising is a movement of reaction. It is literally a reactionary movement, which means it is reacting to something. What is the thing it is reacting to? It is reacting to progress. We often fail to tell this story. There has been tremendous progress, social progress, in the United States in recent decades. It is very different to be a woman today than 50 years ago. It is very different to be a person of color than it was 50 years ago. The country has opened up in many ways. Its demographics are trending in a direction of being a minority country within my lifetime, a kind of superpower of color. And many, many Americans celebrate this, are part of these changes, are pushing for these changes, want to live in that world. And a minority faction has decided they would rather burn it all down than share the country that we all inherit. And so they are not an inspiring, bold movement of big ideas for the future. They are a sad movement of reaction, clinging to the past. They are barnacles on our progress. I don't live in their world. They live in my world. The program we have for a liberty and justice for all would be our program, whether or not they existed. But their movement, that fascist movement, is purely parasitic on the progressive movement that actually wants to build good things and extend the blessings of liberty to all people. So I think we need to remember that this minority faction has opposed every major extension of freedom in American history. They opposed the abolition of slavery. They opposed labor reforms in the Industrial Revolution. They opposed women's suffrage. They opposed the New Deal. They opposed Social Security for old people. They opposed unions. They opposed racial integration and civil rights. They opposed opening the immigration system up to the whole world, not just white countries, in 1965. They opposed gay rights. They have never won a single fight in the long run. They have lost every time. They will lose again. Small-heartedness will always ultimately lose. And the question is this going to be a 50-year backlash, as we have seen sometimes in this country, or is it a backlash that can be put down more quickly? And if it's going to be put down more quickly, it's going to be because we up our skills at persuasion, at changing minds, and actually believe again that it is possible to defeat this revolt against the future by persuading.
All right, Anand Giridharadas, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.